Okay, we're back on the Morning Brew. We're live from downtown. Want to thank Lindy's Cafe for the view out the window. We're very grateful to Lindy's downtown for that. I'm Larry Ahrens, and this is our new co-host of the show, Amber Hendren.
Good morning. Good morning, Larry.
Good to have
morning,
you,
Rob.
Amber.
Hi.
On the couch with us today is a local author, and I'm really anxious to have this conversation. I want you to meet Ron Kresge. And do I pronounce your name right?
You did, just fine.
Thank you, Ron. Rob Kresge. Rob is the author of a new book called Killing Lincoln, and he's here with us today on the couch.
Saving Lincoln.
Excuse me, Saving Lincoln. It's all about the anniversary of Lincoln's assassination, which is coming up next week. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you. And Killing Lincoln is perfectly good because I picked the title Saving Lincoln to be a play on Bill O'Reilly's bestseller, which was Killing Lincoln. So that's a perfectly normal thing to do. And I'm glad to be here. You're right, we are coming up on the 149th anniversary of the night Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater on April 14th. And then he died the next morning across the street on April 15th.
So your book it's historical. The plot's a little bit different. You kind of bring in the conservative, or the Confederate Secret Service. Sorry, Mommy. She's like, don't you know what you're talking about?
Was there such a thing as the Confederate
Well,
Secret
yes,
Service?
and interestingly, at that time, anybody that was involved in getting information clandestinely was called a Secret Service. There was a Secret Service that had to do with Treasury in Washington, D.C., but at that time, the term intelligence, like we think of today, hadn't really been coined or put towards gathering information. So when one of my characters is recruited to go to Washington and be part of the Federal Service, he's called an information officer. They were gathering information, and nobody had called it intelligence yet. It's all part of the history.
What a great plot line.
Yeah.
Sounds like a movie in the making.
Well, I guess it could be. Of course, this idea is that there was a Confederate Secret Service had many plots going on. They supported John Wilkes Booth with money and travel arrangements and other logistical support. But they also considered this plot, which is to fill a wagon with a ton of explosives and send it to Washington and set it off when Lincoln was meeting with his generals between the White House and the War Department. And it would have taken out a lot of buildings. A ton of black powder was an awful lot. And at that time, there was no fence around the White House like there is today. And his guard unit, the Pennsylvania Bucktails, bivouacked on the south lawn of the White House, and they didn't have bullets in their rifles. They didn't guard him with loaded weapons.
Is that really true, or is this part of the book?
No, it's all.
That's amazing.
The south lawn, the guards that were supposed to defend the White House, which they didn't have a fence, they didn't have ammo in their weapons.
Right. They could have loaded them, but they didn't, because they'd been doing this for 3 years by this point, and they were kind of lackadaisical about it. But the whole idea of the Confederate Secret Service really did discuss building this bomb and sending it to Washington. But there's no evidence that they ever followed through on it. But on April 10th, and we're only 2 days away from the anniversary of that date, an important member of the Confederate Torpedo Bureau, and what that meant was explosive, anything that blew up and didn't go out of a rifle or a cannon was called a torpedo. An important member of the Torpedo Bureau was really, actually, historically, arrested by federal forces on a hill overlooking Arlington, Virginia and Washington, D.C. on the night of April 10th. And that character and that incident are in my book.
Excellent. So tell us about your background.
Oh, okay. Well, I spent 30 years in the CIA from 1973 to 2002. And I worked on various subjects over that time. But while I was there, I had a commute every morning. And as I commuted to work each morning and came back in the afternoon, I passed 3 places that figure in this novel. And that sort of got me thinking. I bought a book at Ford's Theater called Come Retribution, which is the Confederate code phrase that they used with a brass wheel to encode the messages to their spies. And that was the message, that was the code word that they decided on in late 1864. Once Grant's forces had surrounded Richmond and settled in for a siege, the handwriting was on the wall, and everybody knew the South was going to lose. So their code phrase up to that time had been complete victory, an optimistic phrase.
Complete victory.
And they changed it to Come Retribution, and that's what the title of the book was. And that's where I read about the plot and got the idea from.
So did they recruit John Wilkes Booth, or did he step forward as somebody that wanted to
That's a good distinction. He did step forward. He was a Southern sympathizer. He had contacts in Maryland, and you know, a lot of places north of the Potomac River were still slave states, or you could still have slaves. It didn't go away in New Jersey for quite some time. So there were lots of Southern sympathizers, and that's what he was. And his plot that he had proposed was that he would kidnap Lincoln and bring him south so that he could be held as hostage, and the North would negotiate a peace that didn't involve, that let the South keep its independence. And he tried, he came close several times to ambushing Lincoln because he didn't have much in the way of protection. But that plot sort of fell through. And by the end of the war, what he did to Lincoln was his own idea. After Richmond fell on April 2nd, and Lincoln had been down touring Richmond for a week, saw the burned out wreckage, and the North didn't burn Richmond, the South did accidentally by setting fire to some gunpowder stores and things, and half the city burned down.
By their own hand.
By their own hand, accidentally.
Did
Okay.
he know ahead of time that the president was going to be going to the play at Ford's Theater?
Yes, he was an actor, so he found out things like that.
Yeah.
And the president was going to go with a young captain and his fiancée and Mrs. Lincoln. And at that time, the president didn't have guards, but they just thought, well, it'd be nice if this couple went along with us. And it gave Booth the opportunity to go, the presidential box is well marked, cut a hole in the door with his knife, a peephole, that he could look through and make sure that the president was there when he came with his Derringer. And it was, you know, he also conspired, he had helpers, and they were supposed to assassinate the vice president and the secretary of state that night. And those attacks failed. But Booth went into it with just a single shot Derringer.
A small
That's
gun.
all he took, a small gun, but close range, back of the head, and it did its damage.
So the Confederacy not only supplied him with the plan, but they gave him travel expenses, they
Well, support-
logistical help.
Logistical support, yes, and it was for the kidnapping plot. They were this other one was set up on his own within the last week before he acted on it, and by that time Richmond had been evacuated. There was no one in his chain of command to approve it or disapprove it. He didn't ask for approval; he did it on his own.
So you'll be signing Saving Lincoln?
Yes, I have a couple of signings coming up. One this Friday at Bookworks on Rio Grande Boulevard at 7 p.m. That's a signing for Saving Lincoln. And then I have another series, and the fourth book comes out in that series in about a week or two, and I'll be signing that at Treasure House on May 13th. I think that's the Sunday before or after Mother's Day. I can't remember when Mother's Day falls.
One of my good friend Joe Badal, who you know, the great author himself, I was talking with him yesterday. He said, you do a ridiculous amount of research on your books. That comes from your CIA background. It's just kind of in your DNA, isn't it?
I think it is. I was an analyst for
Yeah.
the CIA, which means I would take information from all sources, from what we would collect, from what NSA would collect, what the State Department, Defense Intelligence Agency would collect, and we'd watch this as it came together and see what it led us to believe. And sometimes you would try to project, other times you're just reporting to the policymakers what's going on. And that's what the job of that is. I'm not a collector. The people that we have that are collectors of intelligence are usually undercover, and I never was. I was an overt employee my whole career.
And then a writer,
And then the writer.
which is so typical of people here from Albuquerque. Everybody has two jobs, it seems like. I'm a CIA analyst by day and a writer by night.
Well, I did start the writing before I retired. In about 2000, I joined Mystery Writers of America and Sisters in Crime because I knew I was going to write mysteries. And it wasn't until I moved out. I also founded a writers group at CIA that chose to call itself, the members voted on this, Invisible Ink. And these people were going to be writers, and they were at all levels of accomplishment. For I've got an idea, I'm drafting, I write calendars, I do things like this, memoirs, cookbooks, poetry even, you know. And some folks were getting started, and interestingly, the most published field of those who were published was Civil War nonfiction, which is very big in the Northern Virginia area, all over Virginia. Civil War nonfiction. So I rubbed shoulders with people like that,
Yes.
including the fellows that wrote this book, Come Retribution, the senior member of whom had a CIA career before mine.
So
Rob?
Saving Lincoln is not your first book. This is
No.
your third book, and you've got another one coming out.
Well, I have 3 books out already in the Wyoming series, and the 4th book comes out in about 2 weeks. That's set in a town called Warbonnet in Wyoming. Takes place in the 1870s, and Wyoming at that point was the first place in the world where a woman could vote. And the second book takes place partly in Yellowstone, which we think of as the nation's first national park. It's more than that. It was the first national park in the history of the world. Nothing like that had ever been done before till the U.S. Congress made Yellowstone a national park.
Interesting.
Rob's going to be at Bookworks this Friday. What time?
7 p.m.
7 p.m. signing Saving Lincoln. You can meet him there and get a copy of this fascinating book. And thanks for coming down, Rob.
Thank you,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you. I've really enjoyed
Albuquerque Arts and Entertainment Magazine has formed an alliance with a new free newspaper called ABQ Free Press. You'll get the same arts and entertainment coverage with the same fine writers, but with some investigative journalism and know-how on issues that matter to everyone here in Albuquerque. And they brought us Rob today here on The Morning Brew. We'll be back in a moment with more right after this.